Look at it. Just look at the sheer, unmitigated gall of the thing. It's right there, clinging to the trim beneath my bay window, an infinitesimal, pathetic curl of paint, maybe 2 millimeters long. It's the color of diluted disappointment, a shade the Eagle Crest Homeowners Association, HOA, officially calls neutral sandstone. I call it aggressive beige. And this little flake, this microscopic shred of architectural trauma, is about to cost me my retirement fund and, possibly, my sanity. I'm Leo Maxwell. I'm 42, I work in IT, and I own a beautiful, bland, 3-bedroom box in a community that values conformity over breathability. Every morning, I sit out here with my terrible, cheap coffee, watching the sun rise over the perfectly manicured, pre-approved landscaping, feeling like I'm living inside a printer cartridge. And all of it, this entire beige nightmare, hinges on that tiny, peeled fragment. You want to know how the war started? It started with that flake. It started with a piece of paint that only a vengeful god, or a hyper-vigilant HOA drone, could ever possibly see. The delivery mechanism for my eventual doom arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. It was Jeremy, a kid I swear was hatched from an HOA egg. He was 16, wearing tactical khakis that made a satisfying swing sound when he moved, and a lanyard that identified him as Compliance Courier, Level 1. He wouldn't break eye contact, not even when I said, "Hey, Jeremy, nice day, huh?" "Mr. Maxwell," he droned, holding out a certified letter with 2 fingers, like it contained anthrax and the deed to my soul. "I require your signature for this notice of violation and intent to fine. Please use the stylus provided, and do not cross the designated boundary." "The designated boundary is my own porch step, Jeremy," I pointed out. "It is, sir, yes, but I must maintain the regulatory 5-foot exclusion zone during delivery of sensitive materials." I signed the pad. My hand was shaking, not because I was scared of the HOA, yet, but because I wanted to take that stylus and draw a mustache on Jeremy's face. He snatched the pad back, slid the letter onto my step, and retreated exactly 5 feet before pivoting with unnatural military precision. "Have a compliant day, Mr. Maxwell," he whispered, before jogging back to his identical white sedan. God help us all, I thought, picking up the heavy envelope. The paper inside was thick, expensive, and smelled faintly of chlorine and passive aggression. The bold, all-caps header screamed, "Final notice of exterior maintenance degradation." I skipped the boilerplate legal garbage and went straight to the itemized damage. Violation cited. Exterior maintenance degradation. Citing a singular instance of peeling paint near the bay window trim, south-facing facade, photo reference EC733B attached. Required action. Immediate remediation via approved material application. Refer to ECHOA Approved Palette 2.0. All exposed substrate must be sealed and repainted within 30 calendar days. Penalty. Initial administrative fee of $500. Escalating daily non-compliance fee of $50 commencing on the 31st day. $500. For a paint chip the size of a tic-tac. A tiny, insignificant flaw. But the escalating daily fee, that's the real weapon. That's how they bankrupt you into submission. They weren't just fining me, they were telling me my house was offensive to the collective suburban aesthetic. I called the HOA helpline. I knew exactly what was coming, but I needed to exhaust the rational options before embracing the absurd ones. I hit about 7 different menu prompts before I was connected to a human being, or what sounded like one. Thank you for calling the Eagle Crest Homeowners Association, a voice stated, utterly devoid of inflection. You are speaking with Chloe. How may I provide automated assistance? Hi, Chloe. It's Leo Maxwell, 14-20 Tranquility Way. I just got a final notice regarding a paint chip, and frankly, I think it's excessive. One moment, Mr. Maxwell. Accessing your file. Ah, yes. Violation EC 733B. Peeling paint. The determination of excessiveness is at the sole discretion of the Architectural Review Committee, whose decision is final. But I'm looking at it. It's literally one tiny flake. My house is otherwise perfectly maintained. Can we compromise? I'll buy the paint today, and if I send you a picture of it fixed in, say, 48 hours, can you waive the initial fine? I tried the friendly negotiator voice. It felt slimy. Chloe's response was a programmed wall. The administrative fine is assessed upon the issuance of the certified mail. It is non-negotiable, non-refundable, and necessary to cover the costs associated with the inspection, documentation, and courier delivery of your violation. I sighed, running a hand through my already messy hair. Fine. Let's talk about the repair. I'll repaint the trim. But look, my house color is neutral sandstone. It's practically camouflage. Couldn't I, just to give the area a little pop, use fawn beige, which is also on your approved list? There was a slight, terrifying electronic whir as she processed the query. No, Mr. Maxwell. While fawn beige is on palette 2.0, its use is restricted to rear-facing utility sheds or fence extensions. Your primary dwelling facade must strictly adhere to the established, pre-approved color scheme to maintain the integrity of the Aesthetic Neutrality Ordinance. Aesthetic neutrality, I repeated, tasting the bitterness of the phrase. So no deviations, nothing to draw the eye. That is correct, sir. All external features must maintain a state of aesthetic neutrality. I ended the call with a defeated, "Got it, Chloe. Have a neutral day." I stared at the phone. Aesthetic neutrality. That phrase, that crushing, soulless, perfectly engineered term of artifice. It was a gauntlet thrown down, not by a person, but by the very essence of corporate suburban conformity. They didn't just want me to fix the paint. They wanted to crush my spirit beneath a gallon of beige. Suddenly, fixing the trim with a can of neutral sandstone felt like waving a white flag and then paying them for the privilege. I couldn't do it. My IT-addled, principle-driven brain needed a logic bomb, a legal paradox, an act of war that complied with the technical regulations. I walked back to the bay window, knelt down, and examined the offending flake. I had to fix the peeling paint violation, but I didn't have to fix it neutrally. I needed a solution that was technically non-peeling, structurally sound, and aesthetically aggressively non-neutral. I picked up my laptop. I typed into the search bar, "How to paint something so it can't peel." Then I refined the search. How to make a house look old and crumbling but legally compliant. Scrolling through pages of preservation techniques and historical architecture, a single glorious thought blossomed in my brain. An image of peeling plaster and muscular, grumpy angels arguing over a tiny paint chip. I closed the laptop, a slow, terrifying smile spreading across my face. $500 for a flake? Fine. They wanted to impose their aesthetic neutrality on me. I would respond with the Italian Renaissance. I would turn my house into the Sistine Scrape. The beauty of the plan was its utter lunacy. I couldn't just repaint the house neon green. That was an obvious violation of the approved color palette. But the ECHOA covenants were obsessed with maintenance failure, namely peeling, cracking, or deterioration. They had entire clauses dedicated to the structural integrity of the surface. My brilliant, spiteful idea centered on exploiting the difference between paint and fresco. True fresco, buon fresco, isn't paint that sits on the surface. It's pigment chemically bonded to wet plaster, the intonaco. When it dries, it becomes part of the wall itself. It doesn't peel, it chips, it crumbles over centuries, but it does not peel. If I used true fresco, I would be legally compliant with the maintenance code because the surface would be incapable of the original violation. Then came the content. If they couldn't regulate the material, they couldn't regulate the image. I needed something loud, dramatic, and hilariously out of place. It had to be a monument to magnificent ruin, right in the middle of Eagle Crest. My internal monologue was practically a manic-depressive art history lecture. Yes, Leo, forget the Sistine Chapel's grandeur. We want the Roman wall art look, the cracked, aged, slightly water-damaged aesthetic. We need muscular figures, dramatic cloud breaks, maybe a judgmental look from above. It needs to look intentional. Finding a muralist willing to do a full facade was tough. Finding one willing to do a full facade and intentionally fake 500 years of decay was nearly impossible. I spent a day on the phone. "You want me to do a huge 3-story mural?" one guy asked, clearly drawing up dollar signs. "Great! What kind of contemporary nature scene are we thinking?" "No, I need a 16th-century Italian scene," I said. "And the key is, I need you to age it. Faux cracking, intentional water stains, and the whole thing needs to be done in true lime plaster fresco." A pause. "Buddy, I mostly do stylized logos for microbreweries. I don't own a trowel, let alone know what a lime plaster intonaco is. Good luck with that." Click. Another candidate, a woman who specialized in large-scale geometric designs, was less hostile, but equally confused. "I can do the design, no problem. But why ruin your own work? And fresco is incredibly expensive and time-consuming. You know it takes weeks of prep just for the plaster?" "It's a point of principle," I explained weakly. "The HOA fined me for a small bit of peeling paint. I want to install a surface that is physically incapable of peeling. It's a legal maneuver." She laughed for a solid minute. "Dude, you are way outside my price bracket and even further outside my crazy bracket. Find an actual starving artist who reads Renaissance texts for fun." And that, finally, led me to Sebastian "Seb" Firenze. I found Seb on a niche arts forum under the heading "Classical Techniques Available for Modern Spite." His personal website showed photos of beautifully rendered classical studies mixed with images of highly detailed, almost photorealistic graffiti on things like municipal dumpsters and abandoned grain silos. His artist statement mentioned the agony of forced conformity and the tyranny of the straight line. He was my guy. I found his studio in a warehouse district, a place that smelled like turpentine, ambition, and old pasta sauce. The man himself was glorious. He was probably in his 50s, thin, wiry, and draped in a velvet smoking jacket over paint-splattered jeans. He wore a slightly soiled ascot and had a dramatically curled mustache. He spoke with an accent that shifted wildly, sometimes Italian, sometimes vaguely French, always theatrical. "Leo Maxwell," he announced, gesturing grandly with a paintbrush. "Welcome to the Temple of Chaotic Truth. You are the man who seeks to paint a house like a decaying ruin? That's me, I confirmed. Specifically a Renaissance-style fresco on the entire front facade. And it needs to look aged, cracked, and full of dramatic, semi-nude gods and goddesses, or maybe just muscular, grumpy angels. The HOA has a thing about aesthetic neutrality. Seb put a hand over his heart, collapsing onto a nearby chaise lounge, which was, naturally, covered in a drop-cloth. Ah, il destino, an American client who understands the suffering of the truly creative soul facing the suburban void. You do not want paint, amico. You want patina. You want trompe-l'œil of degradation, a monument to magnificent ruin. He leaped up, pacing. But the subject, it must be worthy of the cost, the time, and the inevitable litigation. What is the central tragedy? The central tragedy, I said, pointing to a photo of my house, is that little flake of paint. I'm thinking a scene where a figure, let's call him the Arbiter of Beige, is being judged by disgruntled cloud-born figures with tiny paintbrushes. They're arguing about the flake, maybe passing it around like the Holy Grail. Seb's eyes glittered. Stupendous. I shall call it Il giudizio dei burocrati, the judgment of the bureaucrats, and the figure of the arbiter must be based on their president, yes? Tell me of the face of this Pettigrew, this villain of conformity. I had never met Mr. Pettigrew, but Seb's excitement was contagious. Think severe, prune-faced, a man whose soul is Pantone matched to the sidewalk concrete. Perfect, and for the semi-nudes, the angels must be well-formed but tastefully obscured. We must not give them an easy visual foul. Lots of strategically placed clouds, maybe a few strategically held scrolls or trumpets. Exactly, I said, nodding excitedly. HOA appropriate nudity. It's all about the strategic cloud formations. The negotiation was an event. Seb insisted on only using genuine pigments. Ground from semi-precious stones, Leo. You cannot capture the soul of age with mere acrylic. And a specific, historically accurate lime wash formula. And my fee, Leo, must reflect the integrity of the work, Seb stated, stroking his mustache. I require $5,000 for my materials, $10,000 for the labor, and a further $5,000 per diem to cover the emotional toll of working in a land so utterly devoid of passion. $15,000 plus the $5,000 emotional support fee, I summarized, sweating slightly. This was astronomical. And, Seb added, leaning closer, I require a clause stating that the client, Leo Maxwell, acknowledges that true fresco, by its nature, chemically bonds to the plaster and wall structure. The work is warranted not against deterioration, but against the formation of any peeling defect common to modern paint. We will call it the non-peeling edict. I grinned. That was the legal foundation I needed. $20,000 plus the emotional tariff, on the condition that we explicitly state the work's inherent anti-peeling properties. Done, Seb said, drawing up a contract that looked like a medieval illuminated manuscript. Let the agony of creation begin. The budget had officially gone from a can of paint and an afternoon to over 20 grand. But I was no longer fighting a fine. I was funding a glorious, legally compliant act of aesthetic terrorism. The irony was not lost on me. I was paying an absolute fortune to hire a general contractor to meticulously repair the structural area that held the microscopic piece of peeling paint, only to install a surface that was designed to look centuries older than my actual house. Before Seb could start his artistic sabotage, the original notice of violation had to be addressed. The HOA had cited degradation of the trim wood beneath the paint chip. That required scaffolding, repairs, and a professional, compliant base layer, the actual foundation for the future ruin. I needed to find someone who could put up scaffolding and replace a small section of fascia without questioning the why. Turns out, that's harder than finding a Renaissance master. I hired Danny through a quick Google search for local commercial contractors. Danny was a man who communicated primarily in grunts and loud sighs. He wore a sleeveless shirt even though it was 80 degrees, and his clipboard looked like it had survived a natural disaster. He also had a thick, impenetrable Boston accent that turned every other word into a declarative statement about incompetence. He arrived, looked at my tiny beige house, looked at the giant quote for scaffolding and trim replacement, and then looked at me. "So, you want me to pressure wash the place," Danny summarized, chewing gum like a cement mixer. "Then patch the trim, then put up 100 feet of metal for, what was that word again? Fresco?" "Fresco," I corrected. "It's a form of mural, Danny, like Michelangelo, only less papal and more focused on mocking suburban zoning rules." Danny took his toothpick out and squinted. "Look, pal, I don't care if you're painting it like a pepperoni pizza. You sign my check when the metal's up and the wood's patched. Don't fall off the scaffolding, that ain't covered by my liability." "I won't be falling off. That will be Sebastian, the artist. He's dramatic. Just make sure the base is solid for the lime wash." "Lime wash," Danny grumbled, writing something incomprehensible on his clipboard. "The things people pay for. Listen, the dumpster goes right here. Can't put it on the grass. HOA rules, right?" "HOA rules are unfortunately very specific about dumpster placement," I admitted. "Yeah, that's what I figured. You got rules for everything except common sense." The contrast was delicious. Danny was pure, unpretentious practicality. He saw a job. Wood, metal, money. I saw an artistic crusade. I tried to explain the concepts to him one afternoon as he was hammering a beam into place. "It's about fighting the system, Danny, using their own rules against them." Danny stopped hammering. "I fight the system by paying cash and never answering the phone. You're fighting the system by paying 20 grand to make your house look like a rundown pizza parlor in Italy." He shook his head. "Whatever. Just means I get paid more to fix the next thing." He slapped the scaffolding. "This thing's solid, but don't leave your latte up here. I don't need no coffee stains on my gear." The installation of the scaffolding was, in itself, a violation of aesthetic neutrality. The tall, gleaming aluminum cage felt like a giant middle, finger sticking up out of the perfectly manicured lawn. It was imposing. It was loud. It was gloriously noticeable. I stood in the driveway, admiring the towering structure, feeling a genuine thrill. The house was finally interesting. It looked like a castle under siege, or perhaps a condemned ruin. My neighbors certainly thought the latter. The busiest of the busybodies, of course, were Carol and Gary. They lived 2 doors down and treated the HOA bylaws like sacred scripture. Carol specialized in passive aggression, and Gary specialized in golf. They approached me gingerly, walking around Danny's large tool chest like it might spontaneously combust. "Leo, such exciting structural changes," Carol chirped, her voice 2 octaves too high. She was wearing a coordinated beige tracksuit, naturally. "Are we finally getting that tasteful colonial blue we discussed at the meeting? I knew you'd come around." "Not exactly, Carol," I replied cheerfully. "Think less colonial blue, more Roman Empire, specifically the part where it started to really crumble, but in a very intentional way. We're aiming for a kind of magnificent, centuries-old decay." Gary stopped, mid-swing of an imaginary golf club, his eyes glued to the scaffolding. "Decay? Is that covered by the warranty? Because I heard Brenda Jenkins had trouble with her cedar siding warranty after that squirrel incident. It's simulated decay, Gary. It's art, I explained. The underlying structure is being meticulously maintained and repaired. We're replacing the wood the HOA cited and putting a permanent, non-peeling plaster surface on top. It's a legal maneuver. Carol's smile didn't waver, but her eyes narrowed into sharp, dangerous slits. A legal maneuver. I see. Well, Leo, I'm sure you've checked with the Architecture Review Committee, dear. You know how they feel about unapproved statements, especially structural ones. We value consistency. Consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, Carol, I muttered under my breath. Pardon? Oh, nothing. Just citing a little Emerson. Don't worry, Carol. Everything I am doing is fully compliant with the maintenance degradation statute. I'm fixing the peeling paint. What I put on the fixed surface is simply an artistic flourish. They exchanged a horrified glance, retreating slowly, occasionally checking their perfectly edged flower beds to ensure my artistic chaos hadn't spread by osmosis. The final layer of compliant primer was drying when Seb arrived in his beaten-up Ford Transit van. The side of the van was painted with a scene from a Caravaggio that looked suspiciously like a pizza advertisement. He jumped out, a small, dramatic whirlwind. "Leo, where is the opera? Where is the scent of the sea? We must set the mood for the creation." He carried in his arms crates that held his tools and pigments. One was labeled Genuino Sangue di Bue, genuine oxblood. Another simply said, The Earth of Tuscany, stolen, he said. Immediately plugged in a boombox and started blasting an aria from Tosca at neighbor-annoying volume. "The prep is finished, maestro," I announced. Seb looked up at the smooth, ready surface of the house, then at the scaffolding, then at me. He smiled a truly terrifying, inspired smile. Ah, the blank canvas of mediocrity. Danny has done his part. Now, Leo, we paint the protest. We create il giudizio dei bureaucrati. And with a dramatic flourish of his ascot, the war officially escalated. Seb Ferenzi was not just an artist. He was a performance. He worked almost exclusively at night, claiming, "The moonlight captures the authentic Italian melancholia, and frankly, it is less distracting when the neighbors cannot see me, say." The scaffolding became his stage. He'd arrive after 8 p.m., set up his array of mysterious buckets and powders, turn up the opera, often a selection specifically chosen for its dramatic angst, and begin work on the intonaco, the wet, final layer of lime plaster. He insisted on using a highly specific schedule, only plastering small sections, a day's work, known as a giornata, because the pigment had to be applied before the plaster fully dried. This meant that the front of my house looked, for the next 2 weeks, like a chaotic, unfinished mosaic of gray plaster and vivid emerging Renaissance color. Leo's description of Seb's working methods. Seb would mutter to himself in a mix of Italian and English, occasionally yelling at the inanimate house. "You are too modern, too rectangular. You must accept the history, the aging, the agonia." The mural began to take shape with shocking speed and detail. Seb had an incredible eye for trompe-l'oeil. The painted cracks and faux moisture stains looked alarmingly real, making the house appear genuinely ancient. But the content was the masterpiece. The bottom left featured a sprawling landscape of rolling brown hills, my lawn, viewed artistically. Above this, the central theme emerged. Mr. Pettigrew, the arbiter of beige, was depicted as a slightly portly, frowning Roman emperor, sitting atop a cinder block throne, a subtle dig at cheap construction. He held a scroll, labeled with a tiny, illegible Latin phrase that Seb claimed translated to, "All must be beige." Above him, emerging from strategically draped clouds, were the grumpy angels, the concilium stupidum. They were hypermuscular figures, each holding a comically small, modern item, a receipt, a copy of the HOA bylaws, or a measuring tape. The center of the composition was the object of scorn. A single, tiny, perfectly rendered flake of neutral sandstone paint, held aloft by one of the angels, its smallness completely dwarfed by the dramatic figures surrounding it. It was sublime. The phone calls had stopped. The HOA had moved to direct confrontation. One humid afternoon, while Seb was taking a dramatic 20-minute coffee break in full view of the street, a familiar white sedan pulled up. Out stepped Chloe, the HOA coordinator, now looking slightly wilted and desperate. She wasn't carrying a certified letter. She was carrying a manila folder filled with printouts of the mural's various stages. "Mr. Maxwell," Chloe began, holding the folder to her chest like a shield, "I am delivering a new notice of violation. It is for aesthetic offensiveness." I smiled, offering her a chair on my porch. She recoiled slightly, as if the chair might be artistically offensive. Aesthetic offensiveness? Is that a defined term, Chloe? Or is that just how Mr. Pettigrew felt when he saw his toga? She ignored the jab, visibly trembling as she read from the paper. Violation of Article 4, subsection B, aesthetic offensiveness, citing specific instances of unauthorized classicist figural work and simulated structural degradation, as well as the use of unapproved, visually alarming color application outside the bounds of established community harmony. I see, Chloe. We're moving from maintenance to content. Interesting. But which one is it? Is it unauthorized classicist figural work, or is it simulated structural degradation? I fixed the peeling paint. The new surface is structurally superior to the old one. I am complying with the maintenance code. Now I am decorating the legally maintained surface. Seb, who was not supposed to be listening, dramatically tossed his cigarette onto the lawn and stepped forward. "Woman!" he bellowed, in full maestro mode. "Stand still. Your face, it has the perfect expression of repressed joylessness. I must capture it for the cherubs. The slight furrow in the brow, it speaks volumes about the tragedy of the soul that cannot accept the beauty of the curve." Chloe spun around, dropping a few of her papers. "Sir, I am not a cherub. I am an accredited HOA representative, and you are creating a public nuisance." "A public nuisance?" Seb sniffed, retrieving his cigarette. "My dear, I am creating a public monument to the tyranny of the rectangle. You are citing simulated decay? This is the very definition of art. It is commentary. Find a bylaw that bans commentary." Chloe, now flustered and defeated by the two-pronged attack of Leo's legalism and Seb's dramatics, fumbled to gather her papers. "This is not over, Mr. Maxwell. The board will pursue a court injunction based on material consistency, and the daily fine has been increased." She fled, retreating back to the safety of her beige sedan. The next day, a certified FedEx arrived. It contained a document from Ms. Jenkins, the HOA's lawyer, formally notifying me of their intent to file for a court injunction to cease all work and immediately remove the scaffolding, citing Code 7.3, alteration of approved materials. The fine was now $1,000 per day. I realized I needed to study the bylaws like I was cramming for my IT certification exam. I focused entirely on the definition of material. Was lime plaster considered an approved material? It wasn't. Disapproved. But it wasn't on the approved list either. It fell into a bureaucratic gray zone. My key, I realized, was the contract with Seb. I reread the section about the lime wash and its EAP certification. I found a loophole. The HOA's Material Consistency Code only listed modern synthetic materials. The lime wash, being a natural, centuries-old material, simply wasn't addressed. Furthermore, I could argue that its low VOC composition made it a technically superior, environmentally responsible replacement for the toxic, peeling paint. I felt like I was arguing with a vending machine, but the logic was sound. I was complying with the maintenance rule and exploiting the material rule. The absurdity worked. The house became a destination. Cars started slowing down. I watched neighbors who usually drove with the speed of people late for a funeral slow down to a crawl, leaning out their windows to gawk at the grumpy angels. I started setting up a small folding table on my lawn. I called it the Art Patrons Corner. I sold cheap blue and red Gatorade, calling them authentic Italian ice and charging $3 a cup. The tourists, people driving in from the next county to see the HOA Warhouse, ate it up. One afternoon, a delivery driver attempted to drop off an Amazon package. He parked, stared at the massive, chaotic Fresco, then back at his manifest. "Sir," he drawled, pushing his baseball cap back. Is this an escape room? I gotta get a signature for this cable adapter. It says 1420 Tranquility Way." "It is 1420 Tranquility Way," I confirmed, signing. "And no, it's not an escape room. It's just what happens when people live under aesthetic neutrality for too long. We snap." He shook his head, looking up at the sneering Emperor Pettigrew. "Man, my HOA just got mad about my lawn gnomes. This is next level. Good luck, man." I briefly enjoyed my chaotic fame. I was the champion of suburban spite. But the injunction was coming, and winning the PR battle meant nothing if I lost in court. The court date for the injunction was set for the following Tuesday. The HOA, however, called an emergency board meeting on Saturday, specifically to address the Maxwell abomination. I received a formal invitation, delivered by a nervous, different teenager this time. This was my chance to deliver my prepared legal defense in a public forum, on the record, before the judge heard it. I viewed the meeting not as a reconciliation, but as my opening argument. I ironed my best, only suit, a dark gray number I usually reserved for weddings, and wore a surprisingly bright blue tie. I wanted to look respectable, but not beige. The meeting was held in the community center's sterile ballroom. The air conditioning was set to meat locker, and the lighting was a punishing fluorescent white. The HOA board sat behind a long table draped in a pleated white sheet. At the center was Mr. Pettigrew, looking exactly like the furious Roman Emperor Seb had painted, only slightly less majestic. Beside him sat Ms. Jenkins, the lawyer, looking sharp, impatient, and expensive. Pettigrew banged his gavel. "Mr. Maxwell, thank you for attending this emergency session. We are here to address your—" He paused, struggling for a polite word. "Your defacement of your property." "Mr. Pettigrew," I interrupted, standing up immediately. "I prefer the term artistic application, or, if we're being technical, historically accurate low VOC surface treatment. And I assure you I'm happy to discuss it." Pettigrew's face purpled. "This is a clear act of defiance. You have willfully and grotesquely defaced your property in a manner that degrades the value of every home in this community. The sheer visibility of that caricature of me." I apologize if you saw yourself in the artistic interpretation of the arbiter of beige, sir, I replied smoothly. However, the content of the work is protected expression. Furthermore, the claim of degradation is subjective. I'd argue I've added culture, history, and a major tourist attraction. Before, you had a boring beige box. I'd say I've increased property values, subjectively, of course, by providing the only point of interest in a 10-mile radius. Ms. Jenkins, the lawyer, finally intervened, her voice cool and measured. She had clearly prepared to dismantle my art argument. Mr. Maxwell, while the association does not wish to engage in a debate about the subjective value of your mural, we are not citing the content. We are citing the material. Your original violation was for paint. Paint is an approved material. You did not repaint. You applied a base coat of intonaco, a cementitious, unapproved plaster, followed by a lime wash and pigments. This constitutes an unapproved material change to the exterior cladding. She pointed to the bylaws. We are citing Code 7.3, Alteration of Approved Materials. The approved material is exterior-grade latex or acrylic paint. We are not regulating art. We are regulating structure. This was the core of their legal strategy. Bypass the content and focus on the physical change. I pulled out my own, heavily highlighted copy of the bylaws and the technical data sheets I'd dug up online. Ms. Jenkins, I'm glad you brought up materials. I consulted with my contractor, my maestro, and did extensive research. The original peeling material was indeed an acrylic paint, which, as you know, is a synthetic petrochemical product. What we applied, the lime wash, is a natural compound. I leaned forward. I have the technical specifications here. The lime wash and plaster base are demonstrably more breathable, non-toxic, and critically certified by the EPA as a low VOC sealant, far superior to the approved acrylics. My home now possesses a surface that is structurally sound and ecologically responsible. That is irrelevant, Mr. Maxwell. It is unapproved. But Ms. Jenkins, HOA, pressed. Your approved list only contains synthetic polymers. It excludes the use of natural minerals and binders. If I painted my house with water, would that be an unapproved material alteration? No. You failed to account for materials that existed 500 years before your association was founded. You cannot cite me for using a material that is not on your list, especially when that material is objectively superior and fixes the original violation. Pettigrew slammed his hand on the table. You are twisting the intent of the rules, Maxwell. I am complying with the letter of the rules, Mr. Pettigrew. I corrected the peeling paint problem. Now I have a non-peeling, structurally sound surface. You are trying to use a rule about materials to enforce a rule about taste. That's censorship, not compliance. The board members began whispering frantically. Ms. Jenkins looked frustrated, realizing my technical defense was surprisingly robust. They couldn't argue the content, and my materials defense was creating a deep regulatory gray area. Pettigrew, seeing his position weakening, took a desperate measure. Very well. If you insist on this grotesque display, then you must remove the scaffolding immediately. The scaffolding is an unapproved temporary structure that has been in place for 22 days. That is a clear violation of Code 9.1. Temporary structure limits. If it is not removed by tomorrow morning, the injunction will be filed to remove the scaffolding, effectively halting your work and forcing you into non-compliance with the original fine. It was a brilliant counterattack, focusing on the infrastructure, not the art. I realized the court date was now about saving the scaffolding so Seb could finish. The war was moving to a different front. The HOA had filed a complaint with the county building department about the scaffolding, but they also tried to use the local police as leverage. The next morning, as Seb was up on the scaffolding applying the final layer of faux patina, 2 patrol cars pulled up. I saw the blue lights flashing through my newly ancient window and immediately grabbed my camera, determined to document the next absurd interaction. 2 officers got out. Officer Chen, young and very serious, and Officer McCready, older, with tired eyes and a perpetually bemused expression. I met them at the curb, doing my best impression of a reasonable, besieged homeowner. "Officers, welcome to the Sistine suburbs," I said, gesturing towards the house. Seb paused his work and gave a grand, dramatic wave from the 2nd level. "May I offer you a Gatorade? I have blue and red, or as I call them, the azure of the heavens and the rage of the condemned." Officer Chen consulted her pad. "Sir, we have a report of a disturbance and illegal structure at this address. The caller claimed unauthorized construction and public indecency." "Public indecency?" I repeated, feigning shock. "That is an outrage. The nudity is purely classical and heavily obscured by clouds. I assure you, officer, there is more exposed flesh on the cover of a standard romance novel than on my entire facade." "The illegal structure is the scaffolding, sir," Chen corrected, frowning. "Ah, that's a civil matter for the HOA and the county building inspector, not the local constabulary," I explained patiently. "The HOA is simply attempting to use the non-emergency line to enforce aesthetic tyranny. The only disturbance is the sound of art being made and the occasionally loud groans of a man struggling to afford his property taxes." Officer McCready, meanwhile, had been staring intently up at the mural, leaning against his patrol car. "Wait a minute," McCready said, squinting. Is that guy in the toga flipping the bird to a golden retriever?" Seb had included a small, obscure detail. A tiny, grumpy-looking golden retriever, a known symbol of the HOA's Pet Compliance Committee, which Pettigrew chaired, was being subtly mocked by the extended thumb of a low-ranking cherub. "No, officer," I corrected, keeping a straight face. "That is Saint Sebastian, and he is merely gesturing toward the celestial realm. It is historically accurate to the period's use of visual metaphor. It's an optical illusion." Seb, hearing this, shouted down, "The officer! She has the most heroic jawline, a perfect profile for a figure of justice. Sir, do not move. I must capture the light." Chen shot me a look of pure exasperation. McCready just shook his head, a slight smile cracking his face. After a few more minutes of absurd back and forth, Officer McCready sighed. "Look, Mr. Maxwell, this is clearly a civil dispute. We're not getting involved in your art project versus your neighborhood watch. We're clearing the call as unfounded disturbance. Just try not to let your artist fall off the structure, okay? And maybe turn down the opera." They left, clearly having realized they were dealing with bureaucratic warfare, not actual crime. The police visit was the spark the local media needed. That afternoon, a white van with a Channel 7 News Team logo pulled up. The reporter, a young woman named Sarah, approached me with a camera crew in tow. "Mr. Maxwell," Sarah began, pointing the microphone at my face, "your fight against the Eagle Crest HOA has gained significant attention. Why this extreme reaction to a simple paint chip?" I looked directly into the camera, leaning into my persona as the weary champion of individuality. Because a $500 fine for a microscopic imperfection is a declaration of war on individuality, I stated, my voice calm but firm. When they told me my exterior must maintain aesthetic neutrality, they weren't talking about paint. They were talking about my soul. So I responded with the only thing more aggressive than bureaucracy: Italian Baroque art. I pointed to the house. My paint was peeling. That's a violation. Now, my house is merely displaying an intentional, highly expensive chiaroscuro finish. The surface is chemically permanent. I fixed the problem permanently. Everything else, the angels, the Emperor Pettigrew, the Golden Retriever, is just the price they pay for trying to legislate my taste. The segment went viral locally, then nationally on several HOA horror story websites. I was now a meme, the Fresco Fury guy. The attention solidified the neighborhood divide. Half the houses drove past with their heads craned, honking in support. The other half drove past with their faces buried in their sun visors. Carol and Gary started taking a completely different route to the community mailbox. I even had neighbors who brought me snacks. One elderly woman, Mrs. Peterson, brought me a plate of cookies and whispered, "I always hated the beige, Leo. Never could tell my house from anyone else's." I felt the weight of the court date looming, but I knew I couldn't back down. The principal and the $20,000 were on the line. The morning of the injunction hearing, Seb finished his final giornata. He spent the night applying the last subtle washes of color and the final, beautiful faux crackling. He took down the scaffolding himself, lowering the heavy metal pipes with surprising grace. When the sun hit the facade, it was breathtaking. The trompe-l'oeil effect worked perfectly. The house looked genuinely, magnificently ancient. The grumpy angels seemed to look down on the pristine, beige lawns with disdain. The Emperor Pettigrew was eternalized in his moment of petty fury. It was a triumph of artistic spite, a glorious middle finger to conformity. "It is done, Leo," Seb announced, dramatically sweeping his ascot around his neck. "The surface will hold for 1,000 years. It may crumble, it may weather, but it will never, ever peel." The courthouse was small, sterile, and smelled of lemon cleaner. I was in my suit, clutching my meticulously annotated copy of the East HOA bylaws. Seb sat beside me, wearing a ridiculously formal velvet smoking jacket and, inexplicably, a laurel wreath made of dried flowers. Miss Jenkins, the HOA's lawyer, looked supremely confident. She saw this as an easy win against a defiant amateur. The judge, a woman in her late 60s with a tired, kind face, looked completely bewildered by the subject matter. Ms. Jenkins began her argument, hitting hard on the material consistency code. "Your Honor, the defendant, Mr. Maxwell, has willfully and fundamentally altered the approved exterior material of his dwelling, replacing paint with an unapproved plaster and pigment system. This is an easy case of clear-cut violation of Code 7.3. We are requesting an injunction to compel the removal of the structure and the application of an approved material." I stood up, adjusting my tie. Seb gave me a thumbs up. "Your Honor," I began, speaking slowly and deliberately. "My defense is not about art, although I maintain the right to artistic expression. My defense is about physics and the language of the law." I held up the original notice of violation. The original fine, the genesis of this entire affair, was for peeling paint. The HOA maintenance code is designed to prevent structural deterioration signaled by peeling paint. Now, Your Honor, the material applied to the house is a historically accurate lime wash, or buon fresco. I have submitted documentation to the court, proving its chemical composition. Unlike synthetic acrylic or latex, this lime wash is chemically bonded to the wall's plaster. It is not a coating on the surface, it is a permanent part of the surface structure itself. Simply put, Your Honor, my house is now physically incapable of the original violation. It cannot peel. It would have to be chipped or sandblasted off to be removed. I have not only complied with the maintenance code, I have permanently exceeded its requirement by creating a surface that is structurally impervious to peeling. Everything else, I gestured dramatically toward Seb, is simply content, and you cannot legislate content. The judge rubbed her temples, then smiled slightly. Ms. Jenkins, is there a rule in the HOA covenants that explicitly prohibits the use of lime wash or natural mineral pigments for exterior application? Ms. Jenkins stammered. No, Your Honor, but the intent— I am concerned with the letter of the law, Ms. Jenkins, the judge interrupted. The original violation was corrected, and the new surface, while visually unconventional, is demonstrably more resistant to the maintenance failures cited. The HOA rules are too narrowly written to capture an alteration of this unusual nature. She banged the gavel once. The request for an injunction is denied. The original fine is nullified. Mr. Maxwell is found to be in compliance with the exterior maintenance code. I stood there, stunned, then grinned widely. Seb leaped up, pumping his fists, and briefly hugged me before realizing he was in a courtroom. We walked out into the sunshine. Ms. Jenkins shot me a look that promised a lifetime of future litigation. But for now, I was free. The Emperor Pettigrew was defeated. I sold the scaffolding back to Danny, at a slight loss, but he still complained. I had a magnificent, ridiculous, centuries-old ruin in the middle of a perfectly beige new development. Later that evening, Seb was loading his last box of esoteric paints into his van. So, what's next for the maestro? I asked him, surveying the house, now slightly illuminated by my floodlights. The grumpy angels looked particularly majestic. Seb shrugged, pulling his ascot tighter. Ah, Leo, my work is done. It is the finished masterpiece. But yours? Yours is just beginning. Every day the sun, the wind, the rain, they will continue the work. They will provide the true, natural patina. You see? The peeling never stops. It just becomes intentional. He winked. You have achieved true compliance, Leo. A home that is simultaneously perfect and perfectly ruined. He drove off, leaving me alone with my victory and my fresco. I had spent nearly $20,000 to save $500, but I wouldn't trade it for the world. The fines were gone, the house was a monument, and I, Leo Maxwell, the IT guy from Tranquility Way, was now a permanent thorn in the side of the beige machine. I smiled, grabbing the mail. Another letter. But this one wasn't from the HOA. It was from a homeowner in Florida, asking for advice on how to legally paint his house to look like a sunken pirate ship. My paint would truly never peel again. But the battle for the soul of the suburbs? That was just getting started.